Okay, please could you put your hands together for Chris Wood, please? Thank you.
Welcome back from lunch, everybody. I'm going to be talking about a very simple mark. So simple that it's difficult to say sometimes whether it's accidental or whether it's really quite important. So I'm actually concentrating on a few specific kinds of X mark. And I call them X marks deliberately rather than St Andrew's Cross or Saltire, because those have particular associations. And I'm talking particularly about a simple X, but also ones with lines above or below them. And three kinds of object, ironwork, the so-called witch posts of the North York Moors, and not quite building protection, but bone scoops. They do have a relevance. And my writing's very small there, but never mind. Wrought ironwork. A lot of the older examples may be found in medieval churches, but most of what you see in churches these days, I have to say, certainly from an East Anglian perspective, is Victorian. But it can be very difficult to actually date the metalwork. Finding a vicar or church warden that actually knows anything about the fabric of their churches, down to the level of the metalwork on the doors, is quite rare. Sometimes I've been lucky, as with the Tudor House Museum in Southampton, where they could give me chapter and verse on this front door, which wasn't new to the building when it was installed in the 17th century, but the ironwork was. And you've got some X marks there on the latches. Norwich Castle Museum, that door was installed when it was converted to the museum at the end of the 19th century. That's pretty good dating. Here, Walsingham Abbey Crypt, I was told with certainty that the metalwork is 18th century. That looks rather arts and crafts to me, but the inside metalwork might be earlier. They were able to tell me in St John Meadow Market in Norwich clearly that there were Victorian latches there. So it can be difficult to find the dates, but Jane Geddes cites examples going back to the 12th century, at least of the simple X marks on straps. According to Linda Hall, the mark went out of fashion in the course of the 18th century before the Victorians brought it back. Timothy Easton tells us that a Suffolk blacksmith in the 90s told him that the X with a line either side it represents the barring of entry to a window or a door. Maybe that's a 20th century rationalisation, we have to admit, especially as other blacksmiths just see it as a traditional decoration. Some other examples that aren't on doors, wall anchors. Sometimes they're in the X shape themselves, but sometimes they have the X and lines on them at either end. That's not so common in Britain as on the continent, it seems. But sometimes it can be decorative. On the left there, you've got one of the doors to the Church of St Withburger at Holcombe in North Norfolk. What you see there is pretty much all Victorian, and I would say that's pretty much decorative, at least in its how it's used there. And again, that handle from Walsingham Abbey Crypt. Font cover at Stow Langtoft. I suspect that the handle on there is more recent than the cross that's actually inlaid into the woodwork. But then we go to Cly in North Norfolk. North and South churchyard gates. That's fairly obvious as you walk up to the gate. Could well be decorative. But this is on the top of the hinge. Clear X, elongated X with two lines. That's only somewhere like where people like me look. I don't think that's decorative. And thank you, Brian, for providing the picture on the left, because there was a point I wanted to make that I hadn't got a picture for. This is in the church of St Michael and All Angels in Ledbury, and you've got a lovely lock there, though not an original one, I don't think, looking at the woodwork, with an upright cross. It's in a church. It's a holy door guard, if you like. And look, if you look down at the bottom, there's a latch, I suspect later, with X marks on. Because you do seem to find these in churches at similar sort of locations that are significant. They're important entry points. And here on the right, this latch is actually on the gate of an altar rail. Imagine if this is the altar rail, it's here. You wouldn't see it. So yeah, I would argue that many X marks in churches are marking the place for Christ. But there's earlier metalwork as well. And I don't think marking for Christ comes into it for the strap end here that's, well, it could be, I suppose, but it's unlikely. 5th to 6th century Anglo-Saxon, Roman era brooch, and this lovely linchpin from what's now southern Germany, where it's thought that the human figure at the top is apotropaic in itself, and maybe the X marks at the bottom are to protect the vulnerables lower down. But then heck posts. Hecks are partitions in some older houses in the area of North Yorkshire moors. And they're a feature of 17th century rebuilt houses. And they're basically to keep drafts out of the inglenook fireplace. They end in a stout pillar called a heck post. And here's some examples from Hartley and Ingleby. And but so they're the authors, not the places. And as you see, very commonly, in those that have been recorded, they have X's at the tops, often with these horizontal billets below. And they became known as witch posts, late 19th century. 2 were donated to the Pitt Rivers Museum in the 19th century. The first one, no mention of witch post. Second one, the donor said, they're also sometimes called witch posts. So it had achieved some currency by the time of that donation. On the left is a sketch of how it might have been in a building there's the corridor going through to the main corridor through the house. Here's the inglenook fireplace, and here's the heck with the heck post at the end of it, supporting the beam that in turn supports the smoke hood of the inglenook fireplace. So the folklore goes that the witch post is there to protect the house, and specifically the chimney, from bad witchcraft. Unfortunately, for that theory, it wouldn't protect the inglenook fireplace, which is almost a room in itself. It's actually at the centre of the house, rather than on the edge. On the right here, and I'll come back to this, is a mark from the Netherlands that is on the outside. It's called a steepelteken, and it's on the pillar that is between 2 barn doors. The barn doors close against that pillar. And that is much more clearly an averting mark. But what's going on with these so-called witch posts? Well, there's a guy called Nicholas Rayer, sadly dead now, who argued that the folklore about a priest being involved, and there is some, suggests a Catholic priest. And he did a lot of research about Catholic priests going on the North York moors in the 17th century, when, of course, these date from, performing illegal secret masses in farmhouses. And his theory is that marking the pillar with the X is a sign of a Catholic safe house. Well, I suspect the priest wasn't involved in the actual cutting because these were done with carpenter's tools, done probably before the post was installed or during its installation maybe. But could it still be a Christian symbol? Also, I'll just mention those steeple techniques again. It's interesting that there in the eastern part of the Netherlands, which was more Catholic, and indeed at the time was part of the Spanish Netherlands. And the Spanish Netherlands also included a key Catholic university where some of these English priests trained before coming back to wander around parts of England, supporting the people of their faith. Now, there are other Christian pillars dotted around British Isles and other places where the arms of the cross aren't much wider than the pillar. Various high crosses and cross slabs and so on. So the idea of a Christian symbol at the top of a post may be there. And an X, well, some crucifixes even have an X behind the head of Christ. It may represent the first letter of Christ's name in Greek. Also, if you think about cutting an X, you're incising it, and what you've got left is 4 equal-armed triangles as an equilateral, an equal-armed cross. So could these hex posts actually represent the cross itself and therefore be a house blessing, effectively making it the cross, bringing Christ into the house, making the house paradise, blessing the house? There's a little bit of folklore that's interesting on this score, fairly modern folklore, that if witchcraft affects your house, the milk won't turn into butter when you try to make butter. But if you keep a crooked sixpence in a hole in the top of the witch post, when that happens, you get the sixpence out and you put it in the churn, and that solves the problem. The North York Moors National Park has as its logo an image of young Ralph's cross. And the story goes that there was a farmer called Ralph who happened upon a corpse, a lonely, penniless traveller that died of exposure at that point. And he was so moved that he had this cross erected to show that habitation wasn't actually very far away, and indeed an inn. And that it was carved at the top with a dip so that passers-by could put coins in there, so that penniless travellers could have assistance. It's 9 foot tall, so I don't imagine that was actually the reason behind it. But I do find that an interesting, if anecdotal, comparison. You've got 2 bits of folklore to do with putting coins in a cross, potentially a cross, if we interpret the hex posts as crosses, for use in emergency. I'll leave that one with you as I move on to these, the bone scoops. The earliest dated examples we got were from the 17th century. They're certainly being made into the 20th century. And they're made from the lower leg bones of sheep. It's quite a difficult job to actually carve them without a decent saw, in terms of carving the scoop. They're probably made from many things. They're often sold as apple corers, but some clearly have been used for rope working, found on the Thames foreshore. They're probably used for various sorts of things and carved accordingly. But a very common, not universal, but a very common part of the decoration is our X mark. And the general consensus seems to be that that's there as a good luck charm. They are often made by young men for their sweethearts. Some do even rival Welsh love spoons in their intricacy. And the X as a good luck charm based on the kiss, and leaving aside where the kiss X might come from, that seems pretty plausible. And then maybe we have another example of the X as a blessing. Of course, one of the places where the X as a kiss might come from is the rune, Gifu. And people see these marks and they must be runic I doubt this in most cases, particularly what we're talking about here. If we've got marks that date from the 17th century even, the use of runes of that kind is pretty unlikely in this country. Even in Iceland, magical practitioners weren't using the letter runes for magic in that period. They were using much more complicated symbols. It doesn't mean to say that no one was using them, but that also means that if they were, and we find those marks, our interpretation has to be a bit more careful anyway, because they might have meant different things to them. But certainly, 17th century English church, never mind a Victorian one, probably no one's thinking about runes. Now, the Gifu rune may well have given rise to the X as a symbol of a kiss. There are debates about that. But the lad carving an X into a bone scoop in the 19th century, 20th century, to give to his sweetheart, probably was thinking of a kiss rather than a rune. So, what are the meanings of the X? Of course, it can be decoration. It can be a sign and a symbol. The middle there, X on a ballot paper, that's approval. But it can be a way of getting rid of a web page, or don't drink this water. It can be practical. It can give a good grip. It's also a good way of filling space and giving structural support. But here's an example where it's got two meanings. These paving slabs are both marked as broken, wrong, get rid of them, but they're also marked as this is the one to replace. So there's two subtly different meanings in one use of the mark there. It can be symbolic. The Roman numeral for 10, the kiss, as I mentioned. Extinction Rebellion symbol, which is an hourglass and a barring at the same time. The Saltire Cross of St Andrew, Scottish identity. The fasces is interesting, symbol of Roman magisterial authority, still used by political and other secular authorities around the West. And I suspect it lies behind the X's and the arms of Amsterdam, but given the time, I won't dwell on that. It can be religious, obviously, Cross of St Andrew, but also the 5 wounds of Christ there in the middle. I did notice, actually, up the back there in that window, there's a small 5 wounds of Christ in the window. And it can be the Chi-Rho, and it can be a simplification of the mark of St Michael, or the straight and narrow gate even. And as a apotropaic symbol, it serves many purposes because it can be a direct blocking. It can be a deflection, turning aside. And it can be that blessing, the magical immune system boost. It can go further into a lattice work. It can become the ground of our existence. Jane Geddes talks about lattice work in churches being like the gate or a fence to Eden. Paradise is on the inside. You come into the church and to Christ to reach paradise. But also, that lattice work, rather like you do cross-hatching for drawing, you look further away, it looks solid. We create, in our chemical sense, our reality. Rather like this piece of grasscrete, that the power of nature can come through it. I haven't talked about various other things. I don't have got time to dwell on them now. I don't know if Mark will be talking about patterns in brickwork later. And I haven't dealt with graffiti simply because I haven't found enough examples of the X in graffiti for me to be able to say that's definitely meant as a mark that's not just a scratch. I welcome other examples. So in conclusion, the X can be a barring sign, certainly. It can sometimes just be decorative, of course. But it can also be a blessing, whether or not invoking Christ. And in some circumstances, particularly in churches, I would argue that the blessing in the name of Christ is perhaps the most important reason for their use. Thank you for listening.